Welcome to the Dance Lens podcast, where we take a deep dive on all things dance. We'll look at how the art form is woven into politics, history, and cultural developments, and we'll draw back the curtain on the lives of the artists in conversations with dancers, choreographers, directors, set and costume designers, and more. If you're in the industry or a curious listener, you're in the right place. I'm your host, Cynthia Dragoni. Thanks for listening and enjoy. I am so excited to introduce you to our guest today, Karen Valby. Author of Welcome to Utopia, her work has appeared in Vanity Fair, The New York Times, O Magazine, Glamour, Fast Magazine, and Entertainment Weekly, where she spent 15 years writing about culture. Her most recent book, The Swans of Harlem, is about the founding and early dancers of Dance Theatre of Harlem, where she brings a very intimate and almost lost history of artists, women, mothers, and the company itself, which is, of course, synonymous with its founder, Arthur Mitchell. I'm so excited to meet you.
I'm so happy to be here.
Oh my gosh, I loved this book.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. I'm so happy to hear that.
I cry very rarely, and it was like through the whole book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot. The women show a lot of vulnerability through the book, and they return to us to spaces that had harmed them. So emotions were always on the surface. So I cried a lot during the reporting of the book and during the writing too, and also seeing them now that it's out. Like, it has been a real joy, like a tear-provoking joy, to see them receive some roses. It's been very healing for them.
Well, and it comes through the writing. I hope it doesn't sound rude at all, but it felt like a ghostwriter. Like it felt it came through. There was this container.
Yes. Yeah, it's funny. I'm really proud of the way the relationship formed, in that I was always incredibly clear that this is their story, that they're telling it. I think they needed somebody who really wanted to listen to them. So it's almost like my job was more listening and like being safe so that they could feel some freedom to tell their story. But in the way our deal is structured, the Legacy Council earned the majority of the money. We share a copyright. I hope if that feeling of like the book being a container, that's very intentional. This is not Karen Valby coming in to reclaim history. This is Karen Valby like setting a table so that these women who have been brave enough to take it upon themselves to reclaim their history have a space to do that. So yeah, I love that word, a container. That's what this book is meant to be, was a place for them to tell their story.
I'm really genuinely looking forward to sharing all this. So can I ask you, what was the origin story of the work?
The origin story is the 5 women themselves who, sort of at the dawn of COVID, I think had become fed up with the narrative that Misty Copeland, who herself is not responsible for the narrative, but that Misty was the first Black ballerina, and they'd heard it for years, since her magnificent ascension at American Ballet Theater. But it just pricked at these wounds they'd had, not just from their dance careers at Dance Theatre of Harlem in the 60s and 70s, but then to be told they weren't there, that Misty is pioneering and groundbreaking in a way that didn't allow for their triumphant careers some 40 years earlier. So they formed a legacy council, the 152nd Street Black Ballet Legacy Council, with their idea of, golly, we have been written out of history. Let's write ourselves back into it. How are we going to do that? Maybe we'll do a coffee table book. Maybe we'll do like mass interviews of all the alumni. But they started meeting every Tuesday afternoon. And since 2020, they haven't missed a Tuesday afternoon. That was like their sweet anchor. One of the Swans lives on the same Harlem block as a literary agent who knows me. And so just when Marcia Sells was saying, oh, we formed this legacy council, and yeah, you maybe don't even know this, but I was a ballerina back in the day, and I was a damn good one. And I danced for everybody. And Barbara was so moved by the agency that they were showing and saying, damn it, we were there, and we're going to let the world know. And Barbara knows that I am the adoptive mother of 2 Black girls. And she knows that a Black dance studio, to a lesser degree, my girls are not professional dancers, but a Black dance studio has been very fundamental to my girls' well-being. They go every week, sometimes twice a week, and stare at themselves in a mirror surrounded by other Black girls practicing dance for a teacher who is Black, who sees them as beautiful and worthy of a stage and understands that dance is community. And so Barbara knew all of that. And in thinking about, gosh, there's something here with this legacy council, she told me, just take a meeting and see how it goes. And I joined a Tuesday afternoon Zoom with the women. And I didn't know really what I was there for, and they didn't really know what I was there for. But I asked them to tell me their stories. And right away, it was like, oh my God, like Sheila Rohan discovered dance after recovering from polio. Lydia Abarca, the dance theater's first prima ballerina, was discovered by a nun at her little Catholic school in Harlem who had choreographed a number to Waltz of the Flowers and said, oh my God, this girl has talent. Marcia Sells was 9 when Dance Theatre of Harlem, on its first year of existence, came to Cincinnati, performed. And Marcia, the only Black girl in her ballet class, suddenly sees a stage full of exquisite ballerinas and dancers on point, dancing to rhythmatron, and suddenly thinks, oh my God, I'm not alone. That was all in the first hour of conversation. It was so moving. And I remember my older daughter was homesick from school. And at the time, my desk was in the kitchen. And my older daughter came behind me to get a snack. And she waved at the women. And I got to introduce the women to Ava and say, oh, Ava's a dancer. And up until then, Ava only had the Misty Copeland books or the Misty Copeland dolls or Misty Copeland taped to her door. And we were grateful to have Misty. We were always grateful to have Misty. She's always going to be a hero to my daughters. But suddenly my daughter's looking at 5 more women who can be heroes too, that she'd never heard of, that I'd never heard of. And it just felt magical. So that's a very long answer to the origin story. The origin story.
Long answer.
The origin story belongs to the women. The women made magic happen with their first acts as ballerinas, and they made magic happen again in their third act as they themselves decided their stories had value and needed telling. And I was just the lucky writer who came in and said, oh, tell me everything. I want to listen, and I want to help you be on stage and shine and have the world know you.
Wow, it's awesome. And something that I don't remember if I put this in my notes, I think I did, that the writing, this work of art that exists in this container really caught was, most ballet dancers, regardless of any kind of category that we divide ourselves into, most of us have very complicated relationships with our experience and the art form, and these nuanced complex relationships with our directors. And I try to read all the dance books, And I've never read one that really caught the nuances of that. There's this depth of love and so many other feelings. And that really came through with the stories around Mr. Mitchell.
Yeah.
And I think that's really enjoyable. It's like the books that I read before typically kind of falls into two categories. It's here's the magical dream of this thing, and that's important. Or it's, oh, actually, I'm going to show you the dark underbelly, and it's actually all terrible. It was so much more nuanced. And as a dancer and a person who really loves the art form and the artists in it, I just really appreciate that was so textured.
Oh, wow. Thank you. I do wonder if part of that comes from these exquisite dancers, these women who gave their childhoods to dance, who put themselves at Arthur Mitchell's disposal and said, yes, make me an instrument. Yes, I'm replaceable. Yes, my body is always being criticized by you. Yes, you don't see me as a star. You only see me in the core. Yes, you see me in the short cast, but I want to be in the tall cast. Yes, why can't you see me in this role? Like I have more to give you. I think they were able to tell those stories to somebody who is a layperson, who I enjoy dance. I marvel at dancers. I'm not a dancer. So to me, all of it was real. Like when Carlia Shelton Benjamin would talk about getting lost in the music and almost like her body would join the music and she would enter a state of flow and all of that perfection she strived for suddenly was, and it wasn't a striving, it was a being. That to me, that deserves reverence, that dancer's love for the art. I also see her as a girl who turned on her body because her artistic director wanted her bone thin. It's almost like both things can exist. Your passion is so sincere and so enviable to a layperson. Like when they describe moments on stage or moments within their body or challenging their body or pushing their body, it does sound sacred, like it does sound sublime. And I don't have a relationship with my body like that. And I've never been able to express myself like that physically. I almost feel trapped within my body as a non-dancer. And so those details are magic. And also when they talk, sometimes I would think, oh, I hope my younger daughter moves on from dance. I don't ever want somebody to measure her body or I don't want somebody to make her turn on the shape of her thighs and yet every time I would ask the women, was it worth it? Would you do it again? And they all said yes, because that quest for perfection wasn't just about pleasing an outside source or an audience or a parent or an artistic director. It was some very personal relationship between the girl and dance, the woman in dance. And I think one of my favorite interviews was with Sheila Rohan, who is the oldest of the ballerinas and had such a crazy story in dance, in that she began her life as a professional ballerina as a 27-year-old mother of 3, lied to Arthur Mitchell about her age and the fact that she had kids, and described how when she was 28, first performing with DTH, she was so nervous. She had like such incredible stage fright in the wings and her knees would knock. She was so scared, and I don't belong here and I'm not good enough and my feet are burning. Like she would come off the stage after dancing Allegra Briand and just be crying and screaming. But she was grateful. She was learning. She was there. She wasn't a star, but she was dancing. She's the only one of the 5 who kept dancing her entire life. to the point where even in her 70s, she was performing with the likes of Carmen de Lavalade in a group they had formed for dancers over 60. And she described how, as a 28-year-old, you go on stage and you just think, please don't mess up. Please like me. Please be good enough. Please remember the steps. Please, 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 please. Approve of me, validate me. And then she described being a dancer in her 70s, and she went on stage at Aaron Davis Hall, and she described it as an offering. And I know who I am as a woman. I know who I am as an artist. I know what I am trying to express to you through dance. Take it or leave it, but I am giving it to you with my whole heart. And that's something that makes me wish. I mean, how many times I heard dance is a short career, a dancer's life, well, why? Because there's so much still for a dancer to tell and communicate as they grow themselves. And so when I say I wish my daughters, I hope they don't choose dance, part of me is, well, I hope they choose what dance can be for them.
Right.
And maybe it doesn't have to be these two narratives of this punishing underbelly that you brought up that, drove Kirkland to starve herself or to madness, or maybe it doesn't have to just be this reverential thing that, Balanchine and maybe it can be complex and be we can talk about the complexity and what we lose when we only need it to be dark or we only need it to be ethereal. What is real about the dancers on stage?
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of those limitations that exist within the industry, they are arbitrary. Like in certain forms of, maybe all of them, I'm just not an expert, but classical Indian dance, they have all the generations are on stage. It's the way you would never just have 20-year-old actors.
Oh, that's such an interesting point. Yeah, movies aren't only about 20-year-olds. We always complain that maybe that's when your big movie star moment is, but movies aren't just about 20-year-olds.
They're absolutely not. It's the whole human experience. So I think that would be the closest parallel. Because, of course, other art forms, you could say, well, you can be a writer or a painter in your 90s, but that's not centering artists, whereas, show business is always going to center the performer.
Right.
But yeah, there's a lot of different ways that it can be interesting. Like Pina Bausch, the modern choreographer, she has all ages in her company. And you know what? Even not because, this is a book about ballet dancers, even if we're staying within that genre, in my opinion, the most interesting artists are the older ones.
Right. They're more generous. They're less needy.
Well, and it's just so textured. Mm-hmm. It's like what it means. It's our neuromuscular connections, our muscle memory, our bodies absorb these steps and it absorbs, you're steeped in it, right? It's what is something that's been steeping for 5 minutes versus, it's been there for 20 years.
I think that is such a beautiful metaphor. And I think it's sort of exactly what Sheila was trying to say is she had there was more meaning in her movement. Her storytelling had a richness because of how long it had been steeping. Like you're able to communicate more when you've experienced more, when you know more. Like you're just able to bring a depth to the page, to the screen, to a conversation, to the stage. And it's funny that you use the word arbitrary, like so many of the rules are so arbitrary. Namely, that in the 60s and leading up until then, classical ballet was thought only to belong to the white body. That was an arbitrary decision. I mean, it was couched in so much racism and lack of imagination and, but flat feet and, but curves and, but butts. it's arbitrary. And I think the power of knowing that it's arbitrary means, oh, you can dismantle that
Right.
if you want to.
You can. And the only thing that's real about any of it is just the art form itself, which is a language.
Mm. And I will say oftentimes, I think it's very systemic and just poisoned. But sometimes it is as tragic as just a failure of imagination. You can't picture somebody in a role if you've never seen them in the role. And then, golly, and then they get in the role and Misty Copeland gets to dance Swan Lake. And, well, let's just look at it as if it's the total evidence for can this happen or can it not happen? And so it's imagination that is the problem. If you can't even imagine somebody on stage, or you can't even imagine a body type on stage, or you can't even imagine wrinkles on stage or a softer body on stage, well, then you're not going to tell a story. But what if somebody shoves you out of that mindset? Like, what if somebody introduces something new into the repertoire and it's a sensation? Like, it expands your imagination, which also is all ballet really is, which is fantasy. So,
yeah, I agree with you.
I don't know. I'm just not of this world. I'm not in this world, other than being completely moved and transfixed about the experiences of these 5 women and the women and men who made Dance Theatre of Harlem a sensation in the 70s. But it seems to me that change is so slow and also so possible. But it just takes somebody sometimes as problematic and complex and charismatic and wildly audacious as Arthur Mitchell, who, for all of his flaws, all of the drama he could bring to his company, also allowed for him to think he could build a company. So I've been really pleased the way Arthur Mitchell has sort of been received as in the publication of this book, because I think the women were scared they went too hard on him, or in some places maybe didn't go hard enough on him. But like, how do we allow our Black cultural heroes to be human and not either lionized or demonized? But to me, as much as he could drive me crazy, and as much as I would sometimes think, oh, don't you go after my Gail like that? Don't you turn on Carly like that? How dare you make Marsha make that decision? I also think that his imagination was so unburdened, and he believed he could do the impossible, and he did. I mean, the women to this day know that he gave them a stage. He gave them careers.
Right.
And sometimes he took them away too, but he kept his promise to them. Lydia Barker was 17 when she stepped down the church basement steps to his first audition in Harlem. And she had a job at the bank, and she was supposed to be going to Fordham in the fall on a scholarship. She was going to be the first of the Abarca kids to go to college. And he got a look at her, and she's the most beautiful woman that has ever lived. Like, Lydia Abarca is like a confection of a woman with that very traditional ballet body. And he saw her and told her to take off her shoes. Let me look at your feet. And then she danced for him. And then he said, I'll give you $150 a week to quit your job at the bank and stay with me. The men and women in here, we're going to shock the world. And her mother thought, oh God, don't give up a job. Like, what? No. Arthur Mitchell kept his promise to those kids. They did. Within a year, they were touring around the world. That's an astonishing success in the shortest amount of time for ballet. That's just so wild. So I think he would probably hate this book, but also maybe think, you're damn right we did. We did do all that, and they did all that. And too much about them. It's more about me, more about me. But that time in history should be known, and it should be sustaining to today's dancers of color, or any dancer.
For sure. I agree with you. And, even his character, like there was a section at the end of the book that I thought, wow, I thought so many sections were really beautiful. But one where one of the dancers was saying that he doesn't think this book could have been written if he was still alive because he wouldn't have allowed it to be about them.
Mm-hmm.
But, if we take away race, his character is a character that exists in ballet.
Really?
Yes. And I mean, now they're starting to go out of style,
Mm-hmm.
the last really few years, especially, but the last 20 years, this character has started to fade from being absolutely acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
This like larger than life, sometimes mean to me, sometimes inappropriate, sometimes abusive, but also a great artist, also a great teacher. That is part of the ballet story.
Why do you think?
That's
just because men in power have always gotten away with it?
I think there's been women too. Why is a good question. It's probably layered. I mean, there's talk about vulnerability. The dancer comes into the studio, their bodies are basically completely exposed, and the mirror, and then you have to every day push yourself to the edge of what you can do, which means that every day you're exposed, your abilities are vulnerable every day.
Surrounded by mirrors and peers.
Mirrors and peers, and then whoever your teacher or leader is. It's like those power dynamics it's volatile, and that's built in. Some leaders handle that really, really well, but I think it takes a lot of discipline and a lot of humility. So then you add in the pressures, fundraising, and civil rights being up against the entire society, and one that barely even knows what your art form is, that like loving, complicated, dictatorial style.
Yeah. Mean dad, good dad.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm just so curious when you say, because the women said too, that was just all the directors and like Tally Beatty and Alvin Ailey and Arthur Mitchell, like they were treating their dancers the way they probably had been treated. It's just, generational trauma passed down. But is there a sense, do you have a sense from knowing that that is fading out of fashion? It's unacceptable. It's called out. HR departments get involved. Is there a sense of if that changes the quality of dance? To lose that type of mercurial madman, madwoman at the helm, does the art itself suffer?
That's a great question.
I'm assuming no. I'm hoping no.
Well, we're going to see, because, it takes about 10 years to make a dancer who is trained, right? So we're starting at 8, around 18, you're auditioning. So it's really just started to go out of style within the last couple of decades. So it's going to take a while for that to pick up momentum.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it could have the opposite effect. It could open doors for a different kind of creativity. Historically, the ballet schools, they're based off of the way military academies were run.
Wow.
Like our super organized uniforms, that's a Napoleon thing.
That is so wild.
Before Napoleon, they were wearing tutus in their warm-up classes. Ooh.
Wow.
So you see that culture, so that's woven into it too.
Right.
So if we take, which also means that it doesn't, we're not optimizing for creative dancers, especially with the women.
Right.
So if we take away this more militaristic style, will we lose something? I think that we're going to see changes.
Right.
But also at this point, we have so much technique. It's like we might just flower.
Right. Right. And it's like, it's not saying, oh, we're taking away abusive patterns of behavior. And so now you're all snowflakes who just don't show. Like maybe it's just, we're going to not operate in a culture of fear and punishment. And maybe fear is actually a creative killer.
Right.
And so that doesn't mean standards change or expectations of excellence change. It's just, we're not going to be mentally torturing you.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't have to mean that.
Right.
It's like with so many things in life, there's a razor's edge.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's a lot of the same questions that could come up with parenting.
Right. Right.
How I love you and keep you on this, we are not friends.
Right. But that doesn't mean I have to slap you in the face. Oh, so interesting. So beautiful. Well, yes, these women's stories definitely are of the time of you want union? Get out of here. You want me to not like publicly castigate you and just rip your body to shreds in public? Get out of here. I'll do what I want. I will say one thing Arthur Mitchell had that it sounds like is unusual at ballet companies is he did have respect for that. He wasn't going to have scandalous romances with his dancers. And I think that with both the men and the women allowed for a certain gratitude of a boundary not being crossed. To just take that out of the equation, I think was an incredible gift.
Yeah, right. It's the final frontier, right? It's like I can misbehave, but there is that's your sovereign area.
Yeah.
Sovereign area.
Yeah. Lucky.
I agree.
And I'm sure a lot of it was our mission is too important to muck it up with scandal. And I'm sure some of it was just internalized homophobia or I think Arthur Mitchell remained a performer from the first time he got on stage until his passing. He was never not performing or being Arthur Mitchell or being an ambassador representing, which I will say, as a white woman, it's fascinating and tragic, especially as I try to parent my daughters in a way that is useful to their developing their own sort of racial identities in the world. The women were always told by Arthur Mitchell, you represent something bigger than yourself. You're ambassadors. We're proving people wrong. We are representing. And they honored that role and they took it seriously and they considered it part of their civil rights activism. That was their version of marching in the streets. But I think something that came up over and over again in the book was you had the mantle of being a ballerina, which is about perfection and appearing effortless on stage. Don't see the grind. You don't see the blood and sweat. You don't see the busted toenails. You're there to look to look effortless, in flight, not grounded by the gross forces of the rest of us messy human beings. And then you had to also be perfect as a representation of your people, as an ambassador. And so after their first act of their professional dance careers, they have to learn to wrestle with who am I off stage? Because what is being off stage but being confronted with the fact of your just gross imperfection as a human being and learning to forgive the fact of your pettiness or your fragility or your neediness or your whininess or your depressiveness or your anxiety. And so I think some of the moments in the book that really blew my doors off were when the prima Lydia Barca privately called me to just sob into the phone about finally sharing the fact of her alcoholism and how dark it had gotten there for a while. And she's sort of trying to muster up the courage of, should I share this in a Tuesday meeting with the women? Will they think here goes the prima again, trying to make it all about herself? And I mean, it's her choice, but I said, I just don't see how sharing the fact of your sobriety and how hard won that is and how proud you should be is distancing to your friends who have known you for 50 years. You're sharing something true, and friendship is trusting that your person can see your wounds and your holes and not resent you for that or not judge you for it. And as soon as Lydia got on the phone call and started crying and telling her stories, I mean, the women were so calm and received it with such love and tenderness. What? We don't talk about that stuff. We're invested. And then immediately the meeting ended and one of the other ballerinas calls Lydia and says, oh my God, me too. And I thought I was the only one. And it got so bad there for a second. And I can't believe we have shared that this whole time and never talked about it. And so something that I find ironic about the book is that it's about these like beautiful women, like in states of like flight and lightness, like everything is aloft. But then it was almost like getting further and further away from that time in their lives allowed them to really let go and be light and release themselves of shame, release themselves of disappointment that their careers hadn't done more for them, release themselves from disappointment that they weren't Arthur Mitchell's favorite, release them. And that is lightness. And so it's almost like that lightness they sought as ballerinas, they experienced as young girls, but now they've experienced it again as older women who have said, I'm more than just a ballerina, and ballet gave me so much beauty, but I'm beautiful for parts of me that had nothing to do with performing. And that's true weightlessness. So I don't know how I got on that tangent, but I'm so struck by the word perfection that comes up so much in my conversation with ballerinas, like that quest for perfection. And it's sort of counterintuitive to what we human beings have to make peace with in our everyday lives, which is we are not perfect. We're in fact wrestling with the same thing as our neighbor, with our bus driver, with our kid's teacher, with our kid, like learning how to forgive ourselves for being imperfect. It's the opposite of being a ballerina.
There's a saying in ballet, you'll frequently hear it attributed to Martha Graham, saying that every dancer dies 2 deaths and that the first one is more painful. So when they stop dancing,
whoa.
So it's like that feeling. It reminds me of these Eastern beliefs around our own human death.
Yeah. And to say, even if you've stopped performing, who's to say you're no longer a dancer? It does sound, and again, as a layperson who I'm so struck by that saying. To me, it seems so sharp and so tragic and so full of grief, but also awe for what is the magic of a dancer's life. And yet I want to reimagine that statement as less a dancer knows 2 deaths, as like a dancer knows 2 releases, like that it can be a setting down or a giving up, to God or to the clouds or to energy, that this period of my life is over, but that doesn't mean I'm not still a dancer in my heart or in how I listen to music or how I walk down the street or how The women would laugh, like, you can dance serenade in a chair. Like that sometimes music comes on, that they are just still so swept into the grandeur and their spirits are still doing the movement. I think the word you used was integrating, and I feel like that's what the women tried to do in the book, was they tried to integrate their magical, glorious, rock star, sublime experiences, and hard and infuriating and confounding and grueling experiences as professional dancers. And they tried to weave it into their selves that went on. And I think what had been a block, most particularly for the two women who struggled with alcoholism, was they didn't know how to weave it in. And so it just jammed up, and so much like scar tissue and pain built around it. And it just led to psychological damage. Like, I feel like they needed to release the muscle memory, the trauma, like the fact of their lives as dancers into the rest of their selves, so as to be whole.
Yeah.
And it's funny, like Lydia Barker, who was the prima and the star in all of the Balanchine ballets and danced with Arthur Mitchell and was on the cover of Dance Magazine and, was often tried to be recruited to go to City Ballet, but wanted to stay where she felt seen and whole. She still talks, I just wanted to be a star. I wanted to be a star. And finally, her sisters have started saying to her, the other swans, like, you were, and you are. You were and you are. Like, you keep pining for something that you think didn't happen. We all knew you were a star. And when you say you weren't, you challenge our memories. Like, you were a star. And, it's funny, we were in New York City when the book came out, and we were doing like something that was being filmed. And after each woman would come off set, like I would get a little video of them like doing a curtsy or a bow. And Lydia did this like little jazzy walk and then did this bow. And it was like, oh, you still got it. Like, you're still that girl that like Arthur met at 17 and was like, okay, this is going to work. I've got my star. I don't know. As women, we allow it, or as human beings, we allow other people to determine whether we're valuable or whether we're stars or whether we're worthy or whether we belong. And sometimes I just want to shake my younger daughters and be like, it comes from within. Everybody's broken and striving, like, to look for outside for some validation is just a losing game and will always end in heartbreak. So believe in your value just through the sheer fact of your existence. Like, that carries a person a long way. So yeah, so all that to say, they make me cry still. And the fact that one of the swans passed away before the book came out, it just rips my heart out. And also Gail McKinney Griffith, the first ballet mistress for Dance Theatre of Harlem, a student from Juilliard who despite her technique and years of training was told she couldn't declare ballet as her major, and nobody was ever going to hire her. She was never going to get an audition for a ballet company. She should move to modern dance. And she thought, but that's not who I am. Like, that's not what I've trained for. That's not where I'm at home. And left that meeting with her counselor at Juilliard and was crying in the hallway. And a friend came up and said, well, get up, stop crying, dry your tears. I just read that Arthur Mitchell's auditioning uptown, and that's magical. And she had a glorious career, and dance fed her and she fed dance. And it is so moving to me that she put her story down on record. And it's enraging that she passed and didn't get to see the publication of the book. And yet I look at this young woman And it's, gosh, I've never seen anybody so happy. Look at her. And so she was here, and she has told us all she was here. And I'm not saying this book will be forever, but the fact that Gail told her story is forever. And beauty she made, like, beauty is eternal and art is eternal, and she's laid claim to it. And I am so moved by that.
Yeah. Well, it's even if we don't know a story, that eternalness exists.
Yes.
The stars that we see in the sky, most of them are burnt out already. I think I remember learning that in science class. It's like the light continues, so what we see is actually already not there. So I'm so happy the story has been told now, but even if it hadn't, the light continues, even if it's converging in Misty Copeland. And then, I mean, she's been exciting for a lot of dancers by the sheer fact of her fame.
Yes.
Like a lot of my students, if I've had a lot of little white students who were like, wow, Misty.
Yeah.
Is in front of them.
Yeah.
So they know what's happening. And they're like, she's the hero. They don't even know why.
Right. Right. Oh.
And a lot of dancers just don't even have that fame. But her story wouldn't have been as big as it is if all of this hadn't been happening. So it's like the light does continue.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And one thing I want to say about Misty Copeland, because I think she is so extraordinary and works so hard to lift up other dancers with her, who works so hard and consistently to honor her mentor, Raven Wilkinson. I mean, her book on Raven Wilkinson is so good. I loved it. Who looked so like her heart grew 4 sizes when Lauren Anderson greeted her on stage for Swan Lake. She's amazing. And the idea of light converging, she deserved to know about these women just so that she could understand, what is this light? What is this light? I feel alone. I am alone. But what is this light? And so I think that's sometimes the point of telling stories, is to let other people know, oh, you're not alone.
Right.
We are part of the light around you. And we're naming that light. But that is so beautiful, the idea of the stars, and so true. And that is very much what's going on with Gail right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the light needs to be named.
Yeah.
Right. We don't have, we need structure.
Yeah.
We need to lean on it. Like, how many Hindu gods are there? I think officially aren't there thousands of them, but it's really one. We need categories, and then we can appreciate and understand it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're not the first forgotten dancers. Like,
oh my gosh.
More people know about Deborah Austin than knew about these dancers.
Mm-hmm.
But she's frequently confused with, like, her accomplishments are frequently attributed to Lauren Anderson. There wasn't a big PR culture.
Right. Right.
Weren't on Instagram. It wasn't a thing that you did.
Right. Right. And not just PR, like that idea of self-promoting, like branding.
Right.
Like it just didn't exist. There is something about that I'm struck by, which is nothing will be written about the book. Nothing as beautiful will be written about the book than we got this New York Times book review by this writer, Danielle Smith, which was just so throbbing with feeling. And it was so beautiful and powerful. But she said, like, the fact of their first is cool. But that's like history stuff. And she praised, it's the minutia of these women's lives and personalities and experiences that for her allowed the book to soar. And I think that's what we sometimes miss when we talk about Black women, when we imagine Black women, when we write about Black women, is just the exquisite specificity of each human being. And so when we lose that, then Deborah Austin becomes conflated with Lauren Anderson.
Right.
Because they haven't become specific people, which I know happens all the time with dancers. Dancers are seen sometimes as just bodies on the stage and not. But that was a joy of the book, was talking about 5 deeply specific, profound women. And I loved that my 2 Black daughters saw me delighting, relishing in telling the very specific individual stories of 5 Black women. I want them to be seen as in such specific fashion in their lives as artists or entertainers or whatever they're going to be. I don't want them just to be like the Black girl. I mean, I know that's a wish for every human being, is to be seen as like complex and whole, and that it's not possible in this world, but it's a wish. It's a wish that just it entails a lot of care. You have to be careful with the people in your lives. You have to be careful when becoming new friends with someone. As a white woman, I have to be incredibly careful and thoughtful to not screw up my job as my girl's mother. They have this very big burden placed on them being raised by a white woman. And if I deny that, well, then I've already screwed up. And I think I brought the same sense of humility to, I am not the first choice to write this book. I am not the obvious choice, but I have the honor of doing it. I have taken this on. So don't let any ego or carelessness or selfishness get in the way of what's at stake. And so I almost felt like it's been very gratifying to see how Black women have received this book, that have reached out to me. I'm not speaking as like a monolith readership, but it feels like, okay, I didn't screw this up too bad. And maybe I'm not screwing my girls up too bad. And that just takes a lot of care. So,
yeah, well, the level of love and really, I think humility is a good word. It doesn't register that an ego is endeavoring to stay out of the way. It was
nice.
It was just like I got on a river and went on a river with these women and with this art form, and even with Mr. Mitchell, who I never had the honor of knowing. I have friends who have danced for him, and all of these stories, I mean, they sounded familiar.
You know, we have optioned the movie rights. I don't know if anything will come of that. You know, the women are really hopeful. We're trying to keep it manifested. But it is sometimes we do talk like, wow, whoever plays Arthur Mitchell's really going to get an Emmy, or is really going to get an Oscar. That is just, what a character. What like a force of nature, good and bad and all in between. Like, you know, what a lighthouse of a person, what a hulking figure of a person, what a laughable figure in some ways, like, God, the ego on this guy, and like, what a beautiful physically, what a wonderment of physical beauty and talent. I would have done it. People are always like, well, what's your favorite ballet? And I would have loved to see Dance Theatre of Harlem perform Serenade in 1979. And I would have loved to see Arthur Mitchell dance Puck in Midsummer Night's Dream. Like, those would have been lightning in a bottle moment as an audience member.
Trying to think about who would play him. I feel like we'd have to start with the cheekbones.
Exactly. And we always talk about this, and COVID, like there just kept being like tragedy upon tragedy in COVID. Atrocious things kept happening in the world as like death counts were rising and Black men were being murdered and protests were being like denigrated. And then I remember going online one evening and it was like Chadwick Boseman died and he had cancer, and Black Panther, like my kids here, like he died. And just, whenever we like are silly with each other and talking about casting, I'm like, oh, Chadwick Boseman would have been so, like his face and like the cheekbones that like were like rocks. So I mourn Chadwick Boseman for a lot of reasons. One of them being, oh, what an Arthur Mitchell he would have been.
I think it's related to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation about, like, why don't we have dancers at all stages of life on stages? It's like the idea of the art form becomes calcified.
And,
we're going to go to the ballet.
mm.
And then I think the same thing happens within the dancer. There's a calcification of the idea of myself. So then not being able to shed that, it's not even a skin. It's, I don't know, maybe an armor, a scaffolding.
Yeah, right. Right. It's funny that you use the word calcified, because something that kept coming up when we were on book tour was this idea of allowing ballet companies the freedom to explore varied repertoire and like looking for music from new sources, like looking to make a different children's story, like a new classic, like looking to introduce like a different style of music so that it's not just, okay, well, it's Sleeping Beauty and that, to keep ballet as this like vibrant and relevant thing. And I can only guess at the challenges boards face to try to keep tickets selling and fundraisers, plump. But you don't want art to become calcified, and you don't want it to become that ballet that sounds like the chore or the crusty or the like. There needs, I don't know, and I don't know what the answer is, but calcified is a word that is off-putting, right? It sounds like not fertile and not juicy and not delicious.
Yeah.
And dance is all those things. Dance is
God. And ballet is all those things.
Yeah.
Sometimes it gets, relegated to this spot over here. It's not just funding, though. It's like an understanding of a form of its value. Like when Sleeping Beauty used to be, first of all, a total hit. And it was considered in its time a sellout to low popular taste.
Wow.
It's hilarious. But, ballet in those days was funded by the Tsar.
Right.
You could try things, so it's a whole other, we could talk for 10 hours on the complexities of those difficulties.
In Philadelphia, we had an amazing conversation that was moderated by Shelley Power, who's the executive director of the Philadelphia Ballet. And she's so elegant and so warm and so smart. And I just think it sounds like she didn't speak like this, but what a job she has and she's a former dancer, but to keep ballet, to keep ballet as ballet and not the ballet, but to take advantage of when the ballet is good for fundraising but also to make ballet belong to everyone and to mean that, and it just sounds hard.
I know a lot of very educated people who don't go to ballet, but they will go to opera.
Okay.
It isn't like they can't sit through a long show.
Right.
So there's this fringe quality. It's like people don't even know what it is. Then how do you create commercial opportunities? And I mean commercial in the most basic sense of the word.
Right. And something that parents see reason and value to put their children in. And I don't just mean like rich blonde parents on this side of 35 in Austin who think their daughter in a tutu and tights is a cute thing for her to do when she's 5 and precious. But I mean Girls at Ballet Afrique in Austin. What do we as a culture think ballet offers children? And I don't mean just you can't dance for it. Does it offer them just existential wonders, imagination, beauty, being at home in your body, discipline, blah, blah, blah. But then also, is it just for an elite few to like, what do parents believe when they invest in ballet for their children? And which parents do that? Because I do think when Dance Theatre of Harlem was on hiatus and there was that void of a touring Dance Theatre of Harlem, I think it did stunt a lot of young Black ballet students from imagining themselves as ballerinas or dancers. So it's just so interesting. The other day, I was like going through the major ballet companies, just trying to get a sense of like numbers. Just that's what you do when you have Black children, is you're always looking at numbers. It's comforting, or it's discomforting. And I was like, well, some progress is happening, like maybe, but wow, it's so slow. Sometimes I worry that as like people like slowly brought their Black Lives Matter yard signs inside, it was like, damn, that moment has passed. Okay, well, let's calibrate. Like, how did we take advantage of it? And I will say that when the women were on stage in Boston with Misty Copeland, it's a scene that's in the book, Carlia did say, this is a moment people are listening. And whether that was driven by shame or some wretched tragedy, we need to speak while people are listening. And they did tell their stories during this period, and they got a book deal for it. And the book has come out, and like the readers are buying it, and now there's talk of a movie. Well, that is some good that happened in a moment of collective shame, and maybe it took that time for the women to galvanize and say, people are hungry for stories. Let's tell ours. And they did, and it exists, and now it's part of that converging light. And that's a good thing.
It's a good thing.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Well, the book gave me so much light, and I learned. I was embarrassed that I hadn't heard of
Same.
them. I know, but you're not in dance.
But Misty Copeland hadn't heard of them.
Right.
I mean, that was one of the saddest moments on stage in Boston, was when she said, because first, before the book came out, I wrote a New York Times article about the Women's Legacy Council. And she said she was on a park bench in Oakland. And that was the first time reading the weekend paper that she'd ever heard the name Lydia Abark. I mean, that's not Misty's fault. That's not your fault. That's not my fault. That's not Lydia's fault. That is just, we have a careless culture, especially around matters of Black excellence. And thank God the women felt empowered enough to say, well, nobody else is telling our story, so we have to. And that's the truth a lot of times.
Thinking about who we should cast as Lydia.
I mean, dare to dream. In our little van ride up the Eastern Seaboard for our book tour, I was like, I mean, how is it not Zendaya? But then there's also, or should it just be like a pure dancer? And movies are so mysterious, and they never come to be, and then suddenly they exist, and it's all so out of one's hands. But it is fun to, like when I said, like, I'd do anything to see the women in 1979 dance Serenade, and it's like, what if that's the magic of a movie? Is it takes an audience member back to when they're at their height, and they're like, dancing for kings and queens and presidents, and on a bill with Josephine Baker or with Stevie Wonder in the audience. What if there's a movie that didn't exist in a world where we're culturally careless and don't value Black excellence stories? But what if there's just a movie that's like, here are these women and they're rock stars, and look at them fly. And in the 60s and 70s, like, it's just of such a time and place. And like Dance Theatre of Harlem doing like summer street fairs and like performing on like hand constructed stages, like next to like vendors, and in 100-degree July in Harlem, New York in the 70s, when people said Harlem was like a blasted wasteland. And it was like, actually, it's this place where this magic is being made. It's, I can see it in Technicolor.
Well, Karen, thank you so much.
I cannot tell you how much I have enjoyed this. I find you so deep of a person, and just to hear the way you speak about dance is so meaningful and inspiring, and it makes me want more dance in my life, if that makes sense. You make dance beautiful, and that's how I felt about these women, and I'm so grateful to have had this conversation.
I'm going to read the book a second time. I'm trying to, because I feel like there were some things I couldn't even read. It was so emotional. I mean, I read it, but it was like flood of love and emotion.
I'm so moved by you saying that, because I haven't had the stability or the heart or like the capacity yet to listen to the audiobook. And the women, the five swans, narrate. They each have sort of a section about their lives after leaving Dance Theatre of Harlem. And each woman reads that in the audiobook herself. And Gail, who had passed, her daughter, Hadija, who is also a dancer, reads Gail's section. And I haven't had the capacity to listen to it yet, because I almost feel too close to it, or it's like too intimate. And I'm just like waiting to feel like a little bit of distance from how like close I feel to the women to even be able to listen to it. So I know that feeling of like, I lived this experience. I wrote this book. Like, I know these stories inside and out, and I'm still not ready to listen to them read it. It's so weird, but I can't wait.
Me too. I'm going to hold up my copy here for everyone. Run Not Slowly to get The Swans of Harlem by Karen Valby. You won't be sorry. Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want more dance content, you can follow me on TikTok and YouTube, or sign up for the email list at cynthiadragoni.dance. I'll leave you with this quote from the revolutionary choreographer, Martha Graham. One does not choose to be a dancer. One is chosen. And with that, you live all your life. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Dance Lens podcast. Bye-bye.